Madame Freiberga, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Freibergs kundze, Excellence, Dāmas un kungi. It is a great honor for me to welcome you to the Jesaja Berlina Day and to the prime event of the evening, a lecture by Ian Buruma. This is the third such event. The first lecture, I should remind you, was by Timothy Garton Ash. The second was by Anne Applebaum, and it is a great honor that we can continue this tradition to have great liberal thinkers come in and share with us some thoughts and provoke our thinking. Tagad man ir liels gods un prieks dot vārdu ievadvārdiem bijušai prezidentei Vairai Vīķe-Freibergai, kas stādīs priekšā mūsu galveno šī vakara runātāju. Lūdzu, Freibergs kundze.
Labvakar, dāmas un kungi! Man ir tiešām prieks un gods būt klāt un stādīt priekšā šo trešo izcilo runātāju, kas Rīgu aplaimo ar savu klātienu un ar savu intelektu šajās Jesaja Berlina piemiņas lekcijās. Mūsu šīs dienas viesis ir cilvēks, kas ir spējis daudzu gadu garumā pievērsties ļoti raibai dažādu tēmu rindai, bet kurai cauri vijās ļoti dziļi filozofiski un metafiziski pat un morāli jautājumi, kurus viņš spēja iztirzāt, apcerēt, par kuriem argumentēt ļoti skaidros, vienkāršos, labi argumentētos vārdos. Es visiem ieteiktu, kas to līdz šim nav darījuši, iepazīties ar viņa darbiem, kuri pārkāp pusducis, jo tiešām jebkurš no tiem jums noteikti dos lielu intelektuālu gandarījumu, tāpat kā šīs dienas lekcija. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am truly pleased and honored to introduce today's Jesaja Berlin Memorial Lecturer for this third time in a row in Riga. Ian Buruma is currently the Henry R. Luce Professor of Democracy, Human Rights and Journalism at Bard College in New York State in the United States. And I must admit that there is an academic field and topic which certainly did not exist in my days in academia. So there must be some hope for the world that there are universities in the world that deem it of sufficient academic interest to teach it to their students. He is the author, a very prolific author, and I was telling him that he is what the French call a man with an easy pen, a pen from which words seem to flow with particular ease, and ease both for himself, but particularly for the reader. He is not a man who preaches or sermonizes or pontificates. He does not rant, rave, or fulminate, but gently leads the reader by the hand in a very subtly, and I think quite cleverly, but logically structured series of arguments to looking at really seriously difficult and controversial questions, both in their practical, social, and political implications, in terms of controversies of the day and of current events even of the day, but also in a historical perspective of things that have happened in either the recent or much more distant past, and to look at them from both sides, or indeed from more than two sides, truly examining what led up this or that event to be happening, and what was happening in the minds of the people who were the actors, the participants in such historical events. He has written over a dozen books and contributes regularly to a series of prestigious publications, and is also the recipient of a number of prestigious prizes, most recently the Erasmus Prize in 2008. Among his fascinating books, I might cite The Wages of Guilt, which compares the reactions, the way people cope with memories of Second World War atrocities committed by their people and by their armies in Japan and in Germany, which according to Mr. Buruma are surprisingly different in the manner they approach it. He has a book called The Murder in Amsterdam, where he looks at the feelings, the convictions, the stresses that led to the murder of Theo van Gogh, and the general movements or currents in society that are linked to events of that nature. I very much look forward, along with you, to hearing his lecture for today, which I think very characteristically of his preoccupations, because throughout his books there's this theme about what makes human beings truly human, and what makes civilization civilized, and what makes democracy truly democratic. His topic for today is the crisis of liberalism. Mr. Buruma.
Thank you very much, Madame Freiberga, for those kind words, and thank you for inviting me here today. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be back in Riga and give a lecture in the name of a man I much admire and knew a little bit at the end of his life. The title I saw just now, somewhat to my own surprise, even though I think I thought of it, is The Pleasures of Liberalism. Actually, the theme is the question, is liberalism boring? Because I think it has had that the problem in debates, because to some extent one has to say that it is, at least in comparison to more radical statements. While the liberal is still weighing the pros and cons of every argument, the more radical statements find the headlines and capture the imagination. So I think there is, to some extent, a problem of boringness, but I'll try and perhaps explain why there are pleasures involved in what seems to be dull at the same time. And I'll illustrate the problem by reminding you of a historical event that took place in 1935 in Paris, when there was an anti-fascist conference of writers and intellectuals organized largely by the left, writers like Ilya Ehrenberg were the driving forces of this. So anti-fascism was very much, of course, the jargon of the left and indeed of the Communist Party at the time, but fascism was a serious problem and it was a serious conference. And one of the speakers was the British novelist E.M. Forster. And he came to the podium in his sort of tweed suit, looking like an Oxford professor. People found it a little bit hard to understand him. And he talked about the importance of individual liberty, of liberalism, of free speech, free expression. And of course he was talking particularly about literature. And the subtext, although of course he didn't say this, was the freedom to express himself as a homosexual. But this was even at a leftist conference at the time, or perhaps I shouldn't use the word even, but this he couldn't say. But the interesting thing about it is how it was interpreted. It didn't go down well. The leftist intellectuals at the time, who were famous people like Heinrich Mann, Pasternak and so on, were all there, thought that he was a hopelessly old-fashioned fuddy-duddy, and that his kind of liberalism had nothing to say anymore in the modern world. In the struggle against fascism, much more radical solutions and heroic gestures were needed, and this Oxford Don talk about freedom of expression and individual liberty was hopelessly out of date. And I think he, in some ways, and the reception to it, illustrates the problem that liberals, or those who try and promote liberal values, have very often faced. The anti-liberal view, the view that it is dull, bourgeois, complacent, out of date, and so on, comes from both the right and the left. I mean, the left find liberalism in that sense not revolutionary enough, not radical enough, indeed bourgeois, much too preoccupied with individualism, individual liberty, at the expense of a collective revolutionary project. From the right, you have surprisingly similar language. If you look at right-wing German nationalist thinkers, not necessarily all Nazis, but nationalist thinkers between the two world wars, you find the kind of talk about liberalism that it was incapable of sacrificing, that it was complacent, that it was unheroic, that liberals don't believe in anything, they're always weighing every argument from two sides, and so on and so forth. Werner Sombart, the famous German sociologist and author of Händler und Helden, which says it all really, the merchants versus heroes. Merchants, of course, being cowardly, individualist, mostly Anglo-Saxon and French merchants, liberals, and the heroes, of course, being German, self-sacrificing, nationalist, patriotic, radical heroes. And he coined the phrase comfortismus, comfortism, the bourgeois individualist who only thinks, the liberal only thinks of his creature comforts, who only thinks of material interests, who has no interest in heroic gestures of self-sacrifice for a wider cause, for a great belief, a great utopian project, and so on. So that too is a put-down of liberalism in a sense, that it's too dull. And then you find that, of course, the two extremes often meet. And my host and old friend today in Riga, Robert Cottrell, in fact, introduced me, not because he necessarily approved of it, but introduced me to the French thinker Jacques Vergès. Well, actually, thinker is too big a word. The radical lawyer, Jacques Vergès, controversialist, left-wing promoter of third world anti-colonial causes in the past, lawyer of Carlos the Jackal, and so on. A figure, a very charming figure, who does nothing, who gets his greatest pleasure in kicking the shins of the establishment of France and Western Europe. And he, in his long interview, once said that social democracy is disgusting because it lacks grandeur. It's all about comfortismus. Mao Zedong, Stalin, Hitler, they had grandeur, but social democratic politicians are hopelessly bourgeois and in fact dull, and that's one of their greatest failings in the eyes of this radical. And the interesting thing is that one of the people he quotes was in fact a man of the far right, who was one of the radical right-wing German nationalists who assassinated Walter Rathenau before the war, under the charming slogan, knallt ab den Walter Rathenau, der gottverfluchte Judensau, shoot Walter Rathenau, the goddamn Jewish pig. Now, this same man, a radical of the right, was quoted, I think with approval, by Vergès, who said, "We offer the people a destiny, not happiness." And that's, in a way, the anti-liberal cause in a nutshell. Banality, boringness, and so on. In many ways, and this is where I get to the sort of the positive side of this argument, in many ways, the ordinariness of liberalism is also its greatest virtue. And it's not for nothing that many people who experienced totalitarian regimes themselves, personally, were great admirers of 17th century Dutch art. Zbigniew Herbert, the Polish poet, wrote some of the best essays I've ever read on 17th century Holland, which of course was the golden age of my native country, could not have been more bourgeois. It was a nation of merchants, very unheroic merchants. It didn't have any martial values or propaganda of great national grandeur. There's nothing grand about it. It was, if you compare the architecture of Amsterdam to that of other great capitals, it was almost self-consciously, almost dandyistically modest. But Zbigniew Herbert liked it for that very reason, because painters like Vermeer and others celebrated the ordinary, the everyday, the simple virtues of a bourgeois kitchen, of people having a family meal. The lack of heroism, the lack of grandeur was precisely, of course, its beauty. Tsvetan Todorov, the Bulgarian-born French philosopher, has written essays along very similar lines, also a great admirer of 17th century Dutch art, for the very same reasons. Arthur Koestler, and this is not only Holland, and it looks as though I'm promoting my own background here. My mother was British, and Britain in many ways has very similar virtues that have been admired for the same reasons. Arthur Koestler, who moved to Britain after having experienced being in a fascist camp or in a fascist prison in Spain during the Civil War, then in a concentration camp in France, who had been a communist himself, changed sides, went to Britain, and he described Britain in an essay in the 1930s as the Davos for the scarred veterans of European totalitarianism. And this Davos may be dull, but it has great virtues, as people like Arthur Koestler, Zbigniew Herbert, and Tsvetan Todorov recognized. Perhaps you have to have experienced the horrors of heroic societies or societies with heroic virtues in order to appreciate the quieter and more modest virtues of bourgeois liberalism. Now there is another side to this, and here I will switch the subject, the topic to the Rolling Stones, and you might think the Rolling Stones and Vermeer can have absolutely nothing in common. But while thinking about liberalism and why it was considered to be dull, I came across, not very long ago, an article in the New York Times by a writer from a Czech writer called Fleischer, who is probably now in his early 40s, I would imagine. And he was describing a concert in Prague, and I believe it was in 1990 or 1991, very soon after the Soviet Empire collapsed, a concert in Prague of the Rolling Stones. And he went with his father, who was of the generation of Václav Havel. And Fleischer saw the, to him, almost incomprehensible excitement of Czechs of that age, of Havel's age, when they finally saw the Rolling Stones performing in Prague. This had been their dream all through this communist period, that one day they would have this kind of concert. Rock and roll and the Rolling Stones, to them, was the kind of symbol of a kind of liberation, a kind of individual liberty that they craved after. In fact, Tom Stoppard wrote a play about this called Rock and Roll, in which this is very well expressed. And it's not for nothing that Václav Havel, one of the first things he did when he became president, was to offer, I think, the job of cultural ambassador to Frank Zappa of the Mothers of Invention. And others, Lou Reed and so on, were all, I think, rather surprised when they appeared in Prague and were taken deeply seriously as statesmen rather than as rock musicians. But to people like Havel, one has to understand that this had great significance. This was something people yearned for, longed for, and so on, in the grey and oppressive atmosphere of communist Puritanism. And I believe that there is something actually more profound about this than it seems, because what it means is that although the Rolling Stones' music has very little in common with Vermeer's paintings, it's anything but quiet, it is a celebration of pleasure, of individual pleasure, and an anti-Puritanism. And I would quote something that W.H. Auden once said in one of his essays. And he said, "Among the half-dozen or so things from which a man of honor should be prepared, if necessary to die, is the right to play, the right to frivolity is not the least." And I think there is something, this in many ways explains Havel. And Havel was a liberal, or is a liberal, and he was prepared actually to sacrifice himself, and others like him, to sacrifice themselves for something as simple as the right to enjoy individual pleasure. It's not for nothing that in the American Constitution they have the right to pursue happiness, which is also a very important part of liberalism. It's not just dull virtues of freedom. Well, it's not dull, but it's not just the virtuous celebration of the ordinary and bourgeois life that you see in 17th century Dutch painting. It is also the right to pursue happiness, and that includes pleasure, including sensual pleasure. So this is just to say that individualism is clearly not all dull. The Rolling Stones during before Havel came to power, during the communist period, were of course banned in Czechoslovakia and other parts of Central Europe and the Soviet Union. And there were two reasons why the Czech government denounced rock and roll and the Rolling Stones in particular. One reason was, of course, that they were decadent, and the other reason was that they were accused of being solely interested in money. Now, there is some truth to this. They are businessmen as well as artists. But it's rather typical, again, of the anti-liberal camp to denounce liberalism. It's a variation of confortismus, really, to denounce liberalism for being interested in money, to being interested in trade, the merchants. And this is where Werner Sombart's book, of course, The Merchants versus the Heroes, comes in. That merchant culture, commerce, trade, and so on, is very logically always associated with liberalism, and as such is, of course, denounced by the anti-liberals as being unheroic, parasitical, addicted to comfort, material comfort, and so on. And because merchants have to be ready to make a deal, it's also something that lends itself to compromise. After all, if you're going to make a deal with somebody, if you're going to trade with somebody, you have to find a middle ground. You have to compromise. You cannot be rigid or dogmatic or stand on too many principles. It's a case of give and take, which of course is the other, or another aspect of liberalism. However, even though the anti-liberals like to say, as a criticism, that liberals are always compromisers, they don't believe in anything, they're nihilists, and so on, whereas the radical view is the principled one. It's not actually a fair criticism, because I do think that even liberals, although it's true that if you're a liberal you always have to try and find compromise, but there are limits to compromising. And Jesaja Berlina, in fact, one of his maxims, and I paraphrase, I don't know if I get this right, was always, but even as a liberal, you have to plump. You have to always decide at the end which side of a question you are. You cannot go on endlessly agonizing over the one side against the other. You do have to choose. And there are limits to compromise even for liberals. And I would draw your attention here to a book that appeared recently, written by a friend and at one point a co-author of mine, the Israeli and great disciple of Jesaja Berlina, the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit, who wrote a book called Compromises and Rotten Compromises. And he said in the book that there are certain points on which liberals, they're rare, but that even liberals absolutely cannot compromise. And one of the things in the book that he does is that he divides politics into two kinds. And every society needs a little bit of both, just as every society needs a little bit of both of Jesaja Berlina's positive liberties and negative liberties. You need a little bit of one kind of politics and the other. And the two kinds of politics that he identifies are religious politics and economic politics. And by religious politics, he doesn't mean the politics of organized religion. He means the politics that of principle, of even sacred principles, things that are beyond, that cannot be compromised. And the economic politics are the politics of the everyday in a democracy, of the give and take, of the deals, of the weighing of interests, and so on. The religious politics are those where you draw the line where you cannot compromise. Now, when it's literally religious and sacred, it can be a real problem. And we see this in Israel today, where people who take a sacred view of the status of Jerusalem cannot possibly compromise with the other side, because it would compromise their faith and therefore completely undermine everything they stand for. But there are things that, as I said, liberals cannot compromise on. And Avishai Margalit gives various examples. One of the examples he gives, which I think is at least arguable, is the one when the Allies, after the war in 1945, decided to hand back citizens of the Soviet world, including people from the Baltic states, but mostly Cossacks, White Russians, and so on, who knew that if they were handed back to the Soviet Union, they would disappear into the Gulag or be shot. And the Allies knew this, and nonetheless, they handed them over. To Avishai Margalit, this was an unacceptable compromise. The most famous example of where a liberal couldn't compromise is 1940, of course, with Hitler. And this is where you've got an interesting clash of views in Britain, when the one man who understood this was in some senses not really a liberal. Winston Churchill was much more a man in the heroic mold, who saw history in the heroic in a heroic way, who saw what he called the British race in a heroic, rather pre-war, in a way that is somewhat similar to German nationalists of that period. Nonetheless, I think he knew that you couldn't compromise with Hitler, and to some extent for liberal reasons. Freedom of expression, individual freedom, and so on. And of course, he was backed by liberals. The other side, who were prepared to make a deal with Hitler and prepared to compromise, were not unrespectable men. Appeasers now, such as Chamberlain and Halifax, have a bad name as being cowards. In fact, they had perfectly reasonable arguments. It was not in itself a terrible or immoral thing for them to argue that in 1940 it was best for Britain to make a deal with Hitler because Britain was not in any state, in a military sense, to resist Hitler, so better cut your losses and keep what you've got. But Churchill realized that this would be a rotten compromise, that this would be to betray certain liberal principles which cannot under any circumstances be betrayed. And in some ways it was the luck of Britain and the luck of us all that it took a man like Churchill, a kind of crazy romantic, to realize this at that point, whereas more rational, more reasonable men might have made a compromise. But this it just goes to show that there are certain cases where even liberals have to stand on principle and cannot compromise. Now, I'll conclude with a few words on the debate on Islam and Europe at the moment, because in some ways that is, if not a replay, there are echoes of the debates that Europeans had in the 1930s on totalitarianism, on fascism, and so on then, and the emotions are running almost as high. It's also breaking friendships, and it's, if not as important, certainly important. And very similar arguments are heard today that were heard when Ian Forster gave his talk at the Anti-Fascist Conference of Writers and Intellectuals in Paris in 1935. For example, those who argue that we should treat Muslim Europeans as equal citizens, that we should separate radical Islam from Muslim believers, that one should compromise to some extent to offer space, public space, to Muslims who might have views that we don't find sufficiently liberal, but that we still have to recognize because they are fellow citizens, and so on, are denounced today as people were in the 1930s, and as indeed leftists were in the 1950s, as appeasers, collaborators, and so on. And quite deliberately, the language of the 1930s and 40s is being revived. It's not for nothing that people who take this view talk about Islamo-fascism. So people who are, quote unquote, too soft on Islam in Europe now are appeasers like Chamberlain, or collaborators with Islamo-fascism, and in their way as bad, therefore, as the people who wanted to make a deal with Hitler. And once you start talking in these terms, of course, it's very difficult to have a rational discussion anymore, because then it's about moral principles, about cowards versus heroes, if not merchants versus heroes, and it's very difficult then to find ways in which the two sides can come to any kind of fruitful conclusions. Tolerance is considered now to be, which was, after all, it's one of the pillars of liberal virtues, is now considered by many people to be a form of cowardice. Tolerating intolerance is a criticism I myself have encountered. My view on this really is fairly simple. I think one can be tolerant of intolerance as long as they are simply views. I think there is a line to be drawn, and there is, again, a principle that cannot be betrayed by liberals when it comes to the threat of Islamic radicalism. And I don't mean the threat of Islam, I mean the threat of violent revolutionary Islam. And that is violence. When people threaten violence to impose their views or their revolutionary project, or if they use it, or if they use violence to, let's say, kill a daughter or wife for reasons of tribal honor, then this is something that can never be tolerated in an open liberal society and should be punished. Intolerant views, on the other hand, I think you can accommodate. After all, there are many people who have intolerant views. There are many people who have religious views liberals would not necessarily agree with. There are many religious or cultural habits that we might consider to be illiberal. But I think there should be a lot of room for flexibility without being accused of being an appeaser or a collaborator with a new form of fascism. Violence and the breaking of the law, which violence, of course, necessarily implies, cannot not be tolerated. The answer to the undoubted challenge of a revolutionary Islamic movement that is also affecting Western society and the stresses and strains of integrating large numbers of immigrants and the sons and daughters, more often the sons of immigrants who are having a hard time integrating into Western societies. The answer to this, I don't think, lies in heroic gestures, in the heroic defense of Western civilization in some grand scheme of the clash of civilization. And the clash of civilization, I think, is a very fine example of what I started out trying to say, of a view you can encapsulate in a newspaper headline. And I don't think that this is what is necessary. Or it is even called for. I think it makes it worse. I think we should get away from the debate as though it's a debate between resistance heroes and collaborators. I think it can only, the danger of Islamic violence can only be countered successfully if the true radicals are isolated, not just in society at large, but are isolated within the community of Muslim believers. And we can only achieve that if the majority of law-abiding European Muslims feel that they are on the side, or they're made to feel that they're on the side of the rest of society, that they're on the side of liberal democracy, and accepted as loyal citizens of liberal democracies. If we start to talk about the Western war with Islam, then we alienate the very people we need to isolate the violent revolutionary elements inside Islam. So what we don't want is a Kulturkampf, let alone a heroic one. Freedom of speech should be defended as one of the great tenets of liberalism, but it should not be seen, as it is sometimes by some of our modern heroes, as a license for deliberate insults. There is a difference between giving offense, which is sometimes inevitable if you have a view that clashes with that of certain religious believers or certain believers, tout court, you sometimes give offense. That can't be helped. You can't protect people against feeling that they're being offended. What you can do is try, and I think it's the duty of writers, intellectuals, newspaper editors, politicians and so on, to guard against deliberately insulting. Because this is not giving offense by simply saying, having a view or expressing a view that might be painful. This is going out of your way to insult people. And I think this is something that is not necessary and indeed should be avoided without necessarily going so far as to have laws against insults or on that score. I myself feel closer to the First Amendment in the United States than I do to European laws against hate speech. But I do think in society, for society to remain civilized and indeed liberal, we should avoid insulting. The insult is not, again, a heroic gesture in defense of free speech, which is the way it is being presented by some of our populist politicians today. So I think the problems of integrating Muslims in Europe, of finding a way towards open democratic societies in the Middle East, and so on, I think this calls for liberal values, for liberal attitudes. It calls for moderation, it calls for restraint, and it calls for freedom of expression too. And these may not seem heroic virtues, but I think they are virtues very much in the spirit of the man we came here today to celebrate. Thank you very much. So if you want to insult me, I don't mind.
Okay, I have the honor of moderating the question and answer session, but it also usually gives me the privilege of asking the first question. So let me play devil's advocate here and say, I don't know if you know, but Latvia was pretty hard hit by the economic crisis. And the economic crisis was caused by your liberal comfortismus, by the unbridled pursuit of happiness, by people who wanted to live well now. And the only way to overcome this crisis is through sacrifice, through solidarity, through concern for the collective good, and somebody that can call us to make these heroic sacrifices to reach that sustainable level. How well equipped is your liberalism in helping us overcome this crisis? It doesn't sound like it has the answers for us.
Well, this would have been a very difficult question if you hadn't used one word which lets me off the hook, which is the word unbridled. This is a very unliberal word. Everything, of course, in the liberal world has to be to some extent bridled and qualified. Jesaja Berlina himself was, I believe, to the extent he wasn't all that vociferous about his political views, but I think he was always a Labour voter and certainly a social democrat. So he was not a defender of unbridled, sort of neoliberal market economy. And what you had here, and perhaps even more in Russia, was indeed a kind of a form of gangster capitalism, which the United States went through in the days of the rubber barons, where some people were able to pursue their happiness in an unbridled way. But I wouldn't call, even though the continental European use of the word liberalism does have connotations of laissez-faire economics and so on, whereas in America it just means left. It doesn't, even in the old-fashioned classical 19th century sense of liberalism, even then it's not entirely unbridled, even though that is, of course, an old... the enemies of liberalism in the classical 19th century sense in continental Europe have often associated it with what they used to call Manchester liberalism. And that was associated with Britain, with America, in the case of anti-Semites, with Jews. And that did indeed mean the heartless pursuit of individual gain at the expense of everybody else, and so on. And to some extent, it always was a caricature of liberalism. And I certainly wouldn't say that, it certainly wouldn't fit my defense what I think a liberal democracy should be like.
A little bit of bridles.
There's some bridles.
Okay, let me open it up for questions from the floor, and let me take 3 questions at a time, or comments, but please make them brief. Please introduce yourself, and please use the microphone. So please raise your hands, and I will recognize you. Yes.
Hello, my name is Stas. I'm a student. I wanted to ask, maybe the problem of liberalism is not in its conformism, but actually in failing to distinguish when tolerable intolerance becomes intolerable intolerance, and that this line is so blurry that it just is open for so much interpretations by everybody.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Where do you draw the line? I mean, Karl Popper, I think, is the one who said one can't tolerate intolerance. But because he said that certain kinds of radical intolerance can then lead to violence. The next step is the draw of the gun. Now, it's very tricky to define exactly when you can no longer tolerate intolerance. Do you wait until the gun is drawn? Do you wait until the shot is fired? I think, again, the interpretation of the First Amendment in the United States is actually not a bad yardstick, where certain kinds of discriminatory or forms of hate speech are banned only if there is evidence of imminent danger. This is a much narrower definition than we have in Europe. In Europe, discriminatory speech in the legislation of most European countries is not allowed, even if there's no evidence of imminent danger. In the United States, there is, and that's not a bad definition. So, if there is evidence of imminent danger, you cannot tolerate intolerance or intolerant expression. Otherwise, you can, and you can even tolerate communities that, for religious reasons, think that society at large, especially liberal society, is so wicked that they cannot take part in it. I mean, again, the United States has these groups, the Amish and so on, who dropped out of society. To some extent, the Hasidim live that way too. And these are not liberal communities. And they have many views that are just as intolerant as or illiberal as far as attitudes, let's say, of men towards women and so on are concerned as Orthodox Muslims. But we can tolerate them as long as they don't threaten violence or threaten to blow up the society that they consider to be wicked around them. We can tolerate them dropping out. You can tolerate them expressing their opinions. After all, one of the beauties or one of the horrors of the internet, and we talked about that before my talk, is that you can find any kind of horror, sort of the worst kind of intolerance spread on the internet. The internet is like a sort of an old-fashioned lavatory wall where people can scribble their graffiti and for the whole world to be spread around the world. But to ban it, I think, would be a fairly dangerous step, because then who's going to ban it? And under what circumstances? And if you ban something you think is hateful, or if you give the government or the state the right to ban something you think is hateful, then the next thing is they might ban something that they think is hateful and you approve of. So when it's still in the realm of opinions and ideas, I think you can go a long way to tolerate even intolerance.
Okay. Yes. Up here in the front.
I'd like to follow up on your comment about imminent danger. I think, how do you define imminent danger? If you think of 9/11, if you think of what happened in London, there was a lot of very nasty preaching going on before then. So was there or was there not imminent danger? How do you define imminent danger?
Well, I think, I don't think 9/11 is a good argument for the idea that those preachers should all have been arrested, and that then we would have avoided 9/11 from happening. The mistakes that were made there were mistakes of intelligence, and intelligence that wasn't taken seriously. But that didn't come from the preachers. There was intelligence that people were actually organizing a violent act. And obviously, when you have that kind of intelligence, it needs to be taken seriously, and it's the responsibility of the state to do something about it. I don't think that and this is not to say that if people preach violence in a mosque or anywhere else, that you necessarily should tolerate it. But I don't think 9/11 happened because we allowed those preachers to say what they did. That's, I think, too simplistic an explanation. Yeah?
Okay, but use the microphone, please.
My point was also about judging when there is imminent danger, so people make mistakes. And now, on hindsight, yes, we know for a fact that there was imminent danger, but the intelligence that we had somehow never came together, and therefore I'm saying it's a very weak argument in my point to allow it unless there is clear proof or fact of imminent danger. And the question is, it's always a very flexible point. When is danger imminent?
Well, let me give you another example. Arya Nair, who has spoken here before, the head of the Open Society Institute in New York, became very famous because he was a lawyer for the American Civil Liberties Union. And he became famous in the so-called Skokie case. And for those who are not aware of this, and I can't remember the exact date, but I think it was in the 60s, but I can't remember when. The neo-Nazi party in the United States wanted to stage a demonstration in a suburb of Chicago called Skokie. And a large number of citizens of Skokie were not only Jewish, but they were Holocaust survivors. And they protested against this because they saw this, quite rightly, as extremely insulting, painful, for many even perhaps traumatic, to see people dressed up as Nazis marching or demonstrating near their homes in the United States, where they thought they'd found safety and refuge. Arya Nair acted as a lawyer for the ACLU, defending the right of the neo-Nazis to stage their demonstration on First Amendment grounds. Now, if there had been any hint of a threat that these neo-Nazis did not just want to demonstrate and say, the Aryan nation is great and that sort of thing, or Jews are all exploited, but if there had been any hint that they were going further than that, and we're going to accost people, smash windows, cause injuries, then Arya Nair certainly would not have defended their right to demonstrate. And I think if you look at these things case by case, which is the only way you can look at them, you can usually find where you draw the line. I'm also not saying always. I mean, there's of course always a risk, but there is no risk-free society, and if there were, it would be intolerable. And the risks of giving the state too much power to intervene in the private affairs of citizens, I think, is greater than the possible risk of not catching something in time.
Questions, comments? Yes, Maria.
Maria Golubeva from Riga. Nice to see you back, and thank you for a wonderful talk. The question relates to the last part of your very interesting lecture, and that is the desire to see the majority of Muslim believers in Europe on the side of liberal society, which I think has to be applauded. However, I have a question related to that. And that is, if we remember the genesis of liberalism in Europe, which I think we too often forget, it started off as the political creed of very privileged people. I'm not speaking when the word liberal first appeared in Spain in the 19th century, but rather the ideas of John Locke in the 17th. And the whole notion that you go against perhaps not just the monarchy, but also the political will of the majority, because you have certain claims to autonomy and individual dignity whatsoever, notwithstanding what the majority thinks or does. That was actually the privilege of people who had some leisure and education to reflect upon such things. Now, it seems that in the ages that have passed since, basically the basic tenet of liberalism has not completely divorced itself from some privilege to have leisure and to reflect and to feel protected, sufficiently protected in order to afford those things. In the conditions where ethnicity and immigrant background is largely connected to lack of social privilege. If you think of Germany, if you think of the Flemish part of Belgium, I'm not speaking of the Netherlands currently, where basically belonging to second or third generation migrants means lower academic attainment, less chances of getting a good job, etc., etc. How do we envisage, actually, people who are honestly underprivileged easily connecting to the discourse of the privileged, which liberalism is? And I mean, I call myself a liberal, but I still would say that this is the discourse of the privileged. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me give a slightly different spin on perhaps the status of Muslims in European societies. It depends on one thing that makes a big difference. It depends on who you are. One thing that already makes a difference often is whether you're a man or a woman. And I'll give you the following example. When I was researching my book on the murder of Theo van Gogh, I went to meet a law professor at Leiden University. And he's a law professor who was born and raised in Iran, was a leftist in Iran, so took part in the revolution, was then, as a member of the left, of course, betrayed by the Khomeiniites, had to escape to Afghanistan, to Kabul, then came to Holland. And has become, in his terminology, a great defender of the Enlightenment, European democracy, and so on, but a little bit like certain refugees from the communist world in the 50s and 60s, become almost as dogmatic as the people he argues against in his defense of Western, what he calls Western values. It's always couched in terms of Westerners are decadent, they have to wake up, they don't understand how they have to defend their own values and so on. It takes, in Arthur Koestler's terms, a scarred veteran of totalitarianism to understand this. Anyway, so I was having lunch with him in the canteen of the law department of Leiden University. And he was explaining to me the decadence of the Dutch, and they were just like the collaborators in the war, and freedom and democracy were under huge threat of the Muslims, and it wasn't just radicals, it was Islam, and so on and so forth. And as he was speaking, I was looking around me, and at least half the students in the canteen were women wearing headscarves. And the reason that so many women from Muslim immigrant groups, mostly Moroccans in the case of the Netherlands, are choosing law to study, and are usually, like many immigrants, much harder working and more industrious, ambitious than most of the natives are, is that it's their big chance to get away from the authoritarianism of their brothers and fathers. It's their way of emancipating themselves. I found the fact that they wore headscarves, and not because I have great sympathy for religion per se. I have no great religious beliefs or any religious beliefs myself, but I found this a hopeful sign because it showed that these women felt that they could reconcile the very core of what it means to be a citizen in a liberal society, that is to study law, to know the law, to know your rights and so on, with their religious identity. And so I don't think it's true that they're all underprivileged, that they can't succeed, and that radicalism is a product of economic or social deprivation. It's not necessarily that at all. It's, I think, where it comes from. I've said, I often like to think this. If you want to understand the roots of the violent Islamist extremists amongst the European Muslims today, it doesn't help to read the Quran or to read Karen Armstrong on the Quran or anything of that sort. It helps to read Joseph Conrad and his novels on the anarchists in the beginning of the 20th century, the nihilist with his ticket, with his bomb in his pocket and his raincoat, walking around London, wanting to blow up the world that he felt had no place for him, that rejected him. And this is the danger. And people ask now often, you know, the fact that Osama bin Laden is dead, that we're having a so-called Arab Spring, will this solve the problem of Islamic extremism in Europe? I don't think it will, because the problem in Europe is different from the Middle East. And we still have the second and third generation. I think time will solve it eventually. But I think you still have young people, mostly men, who are confused, who are vulnerable, who have lost touch with the culture of their parents, the village culture of Anatolia or the Rif Mountains, who feel rejected for one reason or another. It can be any reason. It could be, you know, a Dutch girlfriend rejected them, or a job didn't work out. It could be anything at all. Feel rejected by the society that they grew up in, and then are attracted to some great cause that gives them a sense of power and identity and so on. Now, this is a problem that cannot be so easily solved, and I don't think the explanation for it can be pinned down either to deprivation or discrimination. I mean, these things don't help, and unemployment doesn't help, and so on and so forth. But it has multiple causes.
More questions, comments? Yes.
Peter Stermanis. In democracy, especially in crises, liberals have a problem because the voter wants quick solutions, and they generally come from right or left. And the liberals may have the correct solutions, but people don't want to listen. Do you have some solution to this?
No, I don't have a solution to it, because you're quite right. That is the weakness of liberalism is also its greatest virtue, which is that you reflect, you take time, you consider different sides to an issue and so on, but that makes it harder to find an immediate and radical solution. You might say the same thing about in times of crisis. People are disillusioned with parliamentary systems because they see it as, you know, politicians out for their self-interest, they're squabbling, they can't make up their minds, there are too many lobby groups, there are too many interests to consider, and so on. What you need is a great leader who can make decisions and so on. I mean, that is exactly that was the language of the 1930s, and I think it was Italian fascism, Mussolini, that had the phrase decisionism. The great leader makes decisions. He doesn't ponder or reflect, or this is all weak bourgeois stuff. You make a decision. And this is something that people now, too, are sort of disconcertingly hankering after. I think it's a very dangerous route to go, and myself, I prefer still to muddle along.
here and then.
Thank you. Kristaps Petermanis, Riga. Very often the solution in especially post-Soviet societies in nearing them towards what's called Western-style democracy is seen in the education system that basically it should transform people. I must say that for myself, I also had a quite eye-opening moment after going to the Central European University in Budapest, and before I thought that I simply, for example, hadn't read the right book or hadn't found the right author, that the truth is somewhere out there. And what I found out there, for myself at least, was that the value of democracy, liberalism, is not in the one right view, but in being able to some extent to look at a certain situation or at the reality out there, if there is one, from as many perspectives as possible, and to be able to embrace them and to assume one, but to be ready to jump to a next one, to either understand what your conversation partner says or simply to be able to embrace these other views. From your perspective, how important is education for liberalism, for liberal societies? Is it the solution, or, well, could you comment on the role of it in comparison with other factors on which people usually put a lot of hope?
Yes, well, as you say, there is no one solution. It certainly helps if an education system encourages things like civilized debate, rationally working out differences of opinion, and the values of those things, of course. But that doesn't guarantee success either. I think it's even more complicated. I mean, I totally agree with everything you say about there is not one truth and so on. Again, to speak in Jesaja Berlina's terms, I mean, I think his one great insight, and few thinkers have more than a few insights, it's already a huge breakthrough to have one. His one great insight, I think, is that he realized that you have competing goods, that people can have interests that are perfectly valid, that are even good, and there are other people who have interests that are equally valid and equally good, and they conflict in a society. And so it's wrong to assume that different things and different interests and different values which are in themselves good are always compatible. And that's, of course, where the compromising, finding middle ground, finding deals, working out how you can come to some kind of peaceful resolution of these conflicts is necessary. And that is, of course, the liberal part of liberal democracy. So it's not just good enough to say we want democracy, in the sense of the right to vote and all that, which is all, of course, necessary, but you need that liberal component which recognizes that you have to find a peaceful solution to conflicting goods which can be equally valid.
Thank you. Now, in the back there.
Goedenavond, meneer Buruma. I was wondering if you might see a kind of asymmetry in Islamic Western relations with regard to what is published, what is taught. The last time I looked, there was no Western fatwa against any Muslim writer, and that no Western, there is no synagogue in Mecca, there is no church in Mecca, and the last time I looked, there was no Christian, Buddhist, or Jewish suicide bomber who blew up a Muslim community center anywhere in the world. So there seems to be a kind of asymmetry in 18 million Muslims within Europe demand the same kind of rights that everybody else has, while in the Muslim world, Those rights for non-Muslims, there is no Jeffersonian First Amendment, there is no freedom of worship. Jews, Christians, Buddhists do not have equal rights in places like Syria. Coptic Christians are the victim of pogroms. When I see when I hear of Muslims in Holland asking for the same right to to teach curricula similar to that taught in madrasas in Pakistan, my reaction tends to be, fine. When my wife can walk on a Saudi beach in a bikini sipping a pina colada, then there will be symmetry. I was wondering, am I being illiberal?
Well, I think there are certain errors in the first place. The problem in countries like Syria is not religious intolerance, because actually it's a very bad example, because it's a secular police state, and the one danger and I very much like to see the end of the authoritarian regime in Syria, but the one thing it does do is actually protect religious minorities against the violence of the Muslim majority. And it's the one country where you can actually be a Christian or an Alawite, in fact they're in charge, and be protected by the state, which is a secular state after all. Now, this is not to say I think that the Middle East is a wonderful, tolerant, open, liberal place. Obviously it's not. But the implication of what you're saying is that if you were once a citizen, or your parents were citizens, let's say, of the Soviet Union, and you are now a British or a French citizen, and you may still be a socialist or even a communist, you don't deserve to have equal rights with your fellow citizens as long as they don't have it in the Soviet Union. That doesn't make a great deal of sense to me. Surely you can be a European Muslim and have equal rights to other Europeans, regardless of what they do in Syria or Saudi Arabia. I don't think one follows from the other at all. As to the number of Dutch Muslims who demand madrasas, this goes down well in certain polemical books and in the language of populist politicians. I don't think that this is a majority opinion amongst Dutch Muslims, it's very easy to caricature or to use such things to cast aspersions on the majority of Muslims living in these countries who don't have such views.
Yes.
Thank you. I'd just like to return to something that you alluded to during your speech, and you actually mentioned the word caricature in your last answer, so it sort of ties in nicely. You mentioned, obviously there was the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, the Danish cartoonist, the Lars Vilks, who's a Latvian but in Stockholm. What happened with them? You implied in your speech that editors should make the decision not to insult. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, I think on the Danish cartoons, I would not be in favor of a law that banned people from drawing cartoons that were offensive or insulting to any kind of religion. I do think in order to preserve a certain civilized discourse in a society, it is prudent that writers, editors, journalists don't go out of their way deliberately to insult minorities. I don't see any virtue in that, nor do I see any reason to celebrate people who do that as great champions of freedom. I wouldn't ban it, but I do argue, you're right, I do argue that politicians, people who speak out in public, should try not to be deliberately insulting, which again is not the same thing as not giving offense.
But can I follow up on this, because it was a question that I had as well. Okay, so if we do not try to regulate it through law, what are the mechanisms for promoting restraint? among journalists and among politicians, who are the freest people in the world, because they can say whatever they want. How do you create incentives for them to be restrained?
Well, we already work these things out in the societies we live in. You could make a movie in which all the main characters are rapacious, greedy Jewish bankers with big hooked noses. Now, there's no law against doing this, but I don't think a film doesn't come to mind where this is done. And I can give you another example, what I think of the Danish cartoons, where people know where the line lies. Let's take Israeli politics. If the Israeli government were to, let's say, chase out the Arab population in a certain part of the West Bank and argue this in biblical terms. This is biblical land, you have no right to live there. It would be perfectly valid, in my view, even though it would cause offense, to do a cartoon that ridiculed the biblical pretensions of people who are actually misusing it for violence. You could even dress them up as Moses, fine. What you can't do is do a cartoon that deliberately caricatures in an insulting way, let's say, a rabbi because you're mocking the Torah. Those are different things, and editors know usually where those borderlines are. And we know that there are certain words we don't use because they're offensive. Political correctness is not entirely bad. I mean, there is no law against calling somebody a kike, but we wouldn't do it because we know it causes offense. So I don't think people, when they talk about Islam, suddenly pretend that following these rules of civilized discourse when it comes to Islam and so on is somehow tremendously complicated, and how do we know what's right and wrong? We sort of do know. We know what insults, and on the whole, if we're civilized people, we avoid it. And it also depends entirely on context and who you are and under what circumstances you do it. I mean, a journalist can say things that a queen or king or president of a country couldn't say in public. I live in Harlem, in New York. I hear the most used word that I hear in the streets around me is nigger. But it wouldn't be me who would use it. And so people know these contexts. They know, on the whole, what to say and what not to say, and so on. So I don't think it's such a hugely difficult problem.
The questions, comments?
This has suddenly reduced everybody to stunned silence.
Yes, Walter.
I just have a very brief comment on the three virtues that you mentioned regarding Muslims. I think those three virtues apply to Latvia almost at the same level as you refer to them dealing with the Muslim population. And in the earlier panel discussion, I think we were talking about this as well. The tolerance, taking time, discussing things. And I think in Latvia this is a very, very important thing at this very moment when our political situation is in a very fraught state. So I appreciate very much those three comments, and I hope everybody remembers them. Could you please repeat them?
I'm not quite sure which comments you're
Those three virtues of liberalism.
Oh, were the
I
three?
can't remember them now, so.
Well, what were the three virtues? I can't remember. It's getting late. Maybe I'll think of them in a minute.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Andrew Soper, British Ambassador. I have a question about foreign policy, surprisingly enough, and liberalism in foreign policy. When you were talking about tolerance and the extent to which we can tolerate intolerance, I mean, where do we draw the lines here in foreign policy? In some cases, it may be quite clear-cut, and you gave the example of 1940 and Winston Churchill. But we can't be the liberal policeman of the whole world. So what about when our liberal values are violated in faraway countries that we don't care about?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question. I used to be much more sympathetic to the idea of humanitarian intervention than I am now. I've kind of distanced myself from it because obvious recent events. I think it's actually usually, I don't think one should, again, be dogmatic about this. I don't think you can say we should never intervene with armed force under any circumstances. But I think we should do it much less than we are now prone to do. And because intervening for humanitarian reasons in a way is a weaselly way to say we're going to war. And bombing Tripoli surely is not simply humanitarian defense of civilians. I mean, it's more than that. It's intervening in a civil war. And if we do it under the guise of humanitarian intervention, in some ways it gives humanitarianism a bad name, just as the American invasion of Iraq in the name of democracy gave democracy suddenly a bad name, because in many places where people do indeed want democracy, democracy in the United States suddenly it's associated with tanks and bombs and so on. And intervening in wars, especially in civil wars, where it's not at all easy, in most cases, to tell, to make a very clear difference between the heroes and the villains and so on, usually I would say makes things worse. And so I think that there may be cases where armed intervention, Rwanda is possibly an example, is justified, but I think because of the failure of the UN and humanitarian organizations in places like Bosnia, I think now the tendency is to use NATO and national governments to do it, to use armed force for so-called humanitarian reasons, and it seems to me a dangerous route. Do I think that the intervention in Libya was wrong? I think possibly the mistake made there is that there were different kinds of help that could have been given, or different pressures that could have been brought to bear on Gaddafi, not to let it come to the point where it was either we intervene or he starts killing people in Benghazi. But if they'd said it's necessary to intervene, he's a bloody dictator, if he wins, it's very much against European interests, we'll have a refugee problem and so on, that's why it's necessary to go in there, I would have been happier with it than with the argument we're going in there as humanitarians, as though it's sort of Médecins Sans Frontières with jet fighters. I mean, I think that it's a risky confusion of categories. I'd like to know what you think, but maybe I'll hear afterwards.
Okay, I think that people are ready for a little comfortismus.
Yes. And some cool air.
Could you please join me in thanking our Ian Buruma? And I would be remiss in my duty as moderator to not thank our sponsors, which are all available on the program. Soros Foundation, the European Commission, the Riga City Council, the Netherlands Embassy, the British Embassy, Ir and Roberts Books, and the Jesaja Berlina Society. Please find the envelope on your chair, and if you want such events to happen in the future, please consider helping us to do so by donating. Thank you very much to everybody who participated. Thank you for all the questions, and now I invite you downstairs to